This is the London Fintech Podcast, brought to you by your host, Mike Ballerman, bridging the worlds of suits and t-shirts, of finance and technology, bringing you insights, stories, and inspiration from the golden age of opportunity and innovation happening in London right now.
Hi, this is Mike Ballerman, and this is London Fintech Podcast, episode 142, brought to you in association with Smart Pension. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Martin Boyd, President of Capital Market Solutions at FIS, to discuss capital markets fintech. FIS's systems process an astonishing $9 trillion moved around the world per annum. That's phenomenal. They acquired the super well-known FS systems vendor SunGard Systems at the end of 2015, who you may have heard of more. It's funny how the London bus phenomenon, wait long enough and then two or three come at once, affects the scheduling of shows. Last episode's guest was also a former SunGarder, and this is the third episode in a row to discuss the more grown-up end of FS and fintech, hardcore B2B, rather than the frothier hyper end of B2Cs whose names are well known in the national press. Capital markets is, however, the beating heart of FS, far higher tech and far more hardcore than just bank accounts, and thus, by definition, is the most complex area, and therefore a brilliant case study for how digital is affecting the whole world, not just bank accounts and stuff like that. What can we and fintech learn from the super big boys working in this world with trillions of dollars? Plenty to talk about, so let's get on with the show. Hi Martin, thanks for joining me today.
Hi Mike, good to meet you.
So actually the mist is clearing. We're high in Canary Wharf, and I was just saying that from where I'm sitting, the architecture of the city is a complete higgledy-piggledy mess. I don't think I know a city as bad as that, whereas down at Canary Wharf they're still building lots more, and at least it's all tidy around here, even if it isn't sort of the greatest architecture the world has ever seen.
Yeah, you're right, but what also staggers me is how the building continues. You know, I think, we all live in quite tough times, and it's amazing how it's continued to be and grow in this part of London. It's actually quite good to see it. It makes you feel at least that there's a lot of people out there that think there's a good longevity to the environment we're in here.
Yes, absolutely. And I noticed that, I haven't been here for a little while. I noticed that there's all this whole residential area going up. I was thinking, gosh, how scary that would be, living in the sort of, what felt to me whenever I've done gigs down here is kind of a bit like an airport lounge, very sterile. And so you live there and you walk 100 metres to the office and your whole life is here. But the other question on my mind, of a more practical nature, is that back in the day the Jubilee line wasn't ideal, but now it's running about every 15 milliseconds or something. And I was rather wondering how they can actually increase the transport infrastructure, although possibly give it another decade or two, the so-called Elizabeth line will be working.
Yeah, I must admit, it's a bit sad that that's actually not in operation right now, because I think that would take a huge load off and bring massive transport in. I do a lot of flying between here and the US, as you can imagine. And so the idea of being able to get across to Heathrow in 20, 25 minutes is quite alluring, whereas, today it's an hour plus. So it's going to be good, though, when it's done.
Yes, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about it, because, of course, for transatlantic, you can't go from city, can you? If you keep popping to France or Berlin or somewhere.
Yeah, the BA do a service via Dublin, but it's a bit of hassle.
Bit of a hassle getting on and off. OK, so moving on from Canary Wharf, where I'm extremely grateful that actually I got in and downstairs. I'm obviously looking very suspicious today, because I turned up at the reception and they asked me, "Where's your ID?" At which point I always think of sort of Second World War films, actually, but apparently you should be carrying ID these days. It's rather fortunate I had some, otherwise I wouldn't have been let in. And anyway, then having been told to go and sort of sit over there, I had two security people coming and checking my pass, one of whom accompanied me in the lift on the way up. So maybe I should be more smart next time I come. And we were talking about sort of energy and rushing around and things like that, and you were saying that in terms of flying to America, in terms of working in intense businesses in intense places like Canary Wharf, and having gone to university the same year that I did, so you're older and wiser by now, that the sort of whole energy management thing is something that you've focused on, and you look quite trim, unlike me, so you've obviously done quite a good job of it. And actually, it's a point I've mentioned before about fintech, but not for quite a long time, which is that certainly in the early days, you saw some people who were sort of working themselves to death, and also eating and drinking themselves to death, and 2 or 3 years into the fintech revolution, you'd see people who were really kind of losing it, putting on a lot of weight, looking like a wreck. Yeah. Now, that's kind of almost like exam revision mode. You've got your exams in 3 weeks' time. Okay, just eat sweeties and biscuits and have a beer or whatever just to keep you going. But you can't do that for years. And you certainly, going back to older and wiser folks like you and I, you can't do it for decades. So it's actually a very important part of sort of being a businessman or businesswoman these days.
I think it is, and I don't know, honestly, Mike, what the right answer is, because we go through moments of incredibly intense activity from a business standpoint, which you can't step back from and unwind. You have to do it. But then you also have to find some space, because if you don't do that, to your point, you don't get an opportunity to recharge. When I think about recharging, it's not about sitting down and just relaxing. I get a lot of personal satisfaction from doing different things outside of work. Do a lot of fundraising activity locally. Actually, got a cottage in a small village out in the west, and things like doing breakfast for the over 75s in the village, every so often, and things like that, which they keep you really active in terms of just working, talking to people and socialising, but they're very rewarding as well. So that combination is good.
And you're very grounded, so you're not just living this kind of life of, as people will soon, you live in Canary Wharf, walk 100 metres and just go backwards and forwards, and you've got 7 days here in a sort of slightly abstracted world. You actually meet real people in the real world, real human beings.
You have to do that because, it's, it is as intense as business is. And in fact, it's interesting you say that, because one other way in which I try and manage my time when at work is I do quite a bit of mentoring. And when I think about things that drive me from a personal satisfaction standpoint at work, it's a combination of obviously business success. I think with success, that enables you to do other things. But I also get huge satisfaction having seen and touched others' careers. And as my career has gone on, I've spent a decent amount of time mentoring individuals in that environment. And it's a great way of actually stepping back a bit from the pressure of the moment to hear what other people are doing and offering input or guidance around that.
Yes, and I think that's one of the easily forgotten advantages of working in sort of megaco, which is that there is a whole hierarchy there, and there are people around who have got decades of experience. I mean, certainly in some of the smaller companies, there are none of the sort of grey hair or no hair brigade like you or I, who've seen the world for 30 years and understand kind of the meta topics of working rather than just the content. So a lot of people, and maybe this is an interesting idea about fintech as a whole, a lot of people don't really get the older, wiser guidance. And I know myself that I'm immensely grateful for those people who are older and wiser than I when I joined Climeworks in 85, 10, 20, 30 years older, who passed on a lot of wisdom and saved me learning the hard way.
I do think that's the case.
Well, we do now wear that. We'd have thought the young Turks was the idea 30 years ago.
But it actually does work in both directions. By spending that time with people who are newer into the business, the surprising things come out around the way we're doing things, which you kind of then think, oh, really? We're doing it that way? Well, yeah, no, you're right. That doesn't make sense. Why are we doing it that way? So you do get a perspective that you otherwise don't get if you're just doing what you do every day.
Yes, absolutely. I think the important point is it's actually a two-way flow.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not a sort of a one-way flow. So in terms of your day job, how have you ended up here today looking west over the city?
So I started a small business with some contacts I met actually working for KPMG out in Australia during the early 90s. Started a business with them and some independent software developers. And that business was acquired in 2000. And from then, as I think a lot of business entrepreneurs or people who start out in smaller businesses maybe think, I sort of thought, well, I'll be here for a year and a half and, move on and do the next thing. And I think what was surprising for me was the impact I could have in the organisation. And as I mentioned to you before, I'm someone who thrives on being given challenges and seeing the next change coming. And as long as that's happening regularly enough, I've always found actually the time I spent with FIS and SunGard before it has been, has always provided that challenge. So through leadership roles and now running a division of the organisation, it's been a good journey, but good grounding. One of my earliest jobs was actually working for IBM as a salesperson. It's a grounding. I did that for 7 years or so. And it's a grounding. I even think back to some of the sales school activities around building business cases and things like that, and asking questions of people and listening to their responses. They're just such invaluable life skills as well as business skills.
Yes, absolutely. I think the one I remember was you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, use them in that ratio. Something I never managed to achieve myself, but it's a kind of North Star, really, even if I've been heading south on most of my
it's still an ambition.
It's still, well, yes, I think I've kind of given up on ambitions now. I'm too old to have ambitions. Sort of waking up the next day is quite an achievement. Yes, and to your point about having been a small co person and a big co person, sometimes I get asked, especially by these young people-y type things, should I work in big co or small co? I said, well, how do I know? They're very different gigs. They've got different pros and cons. They suit different people. And more to the point, at different stages in your career, you might work in one and you might work in another. And, there isn't really a right answer. But I think what you've outlined about the big co is what I always experienced myself at Kleinworts, that if you're working in, quotes, a good big co, unquotes, there are lots of interesting gigs and jobs around, and if you do a good job and it's a good organisation, they will give you opportunities to go and do something else. Oh, you've succeeded here, do something different. And certainly at Kleinworts, I went from one thing to something completely different I'd never done before. Now, if I was trying to do that in the marketplace, I could speak to some headhunter or something, well, what do you know about this? Nothing. Oh, well, that's no good. Forget it. Whereas in a larger organisation, oh, Martin's a good guy or Mike's a good guy. I'm sure you'll figure it out, and you get moved somewhere. It's like a knight move in chess. You can do knight moves in chess in an organisation.
Well, yeah, and I think because as an organisation, or hopefully if you've got enlightened leadership, then they're looking at what your competency is and your energy level is and your attitude is, and knowing that you've got the right combination from that respect, they can pretty much take on any role within the business. And certainly the big leaps I've had from a career point of view have actually been moving within an organisation between roles, then leveraging that later on, perhaps going somewhere else. But certainly I'd agree with you, yeah.
I mean, for example, you're running the social media at a sort of small fintech, and then one day you want to go and run marketing at another fintech. You're unlikely to make that sort of huge leap, and it can be quite tricky. Right, okay, so small co, big co, they're all there. And as I said before, I think there were less medium co's than there used to be, but that's another conversation. So coming on to the main course then, capital markets fintech. Capital markets is a phrase we all use, we've all heard a million times, but like a lot of these phrases, it just kind of gets repeated, and sometimes people mean different things by it. It's not particularly defined. So having spent our lifetime in capital markets, one way or another, what is capital markets?
Well, you sort of alluded to it earlier on. It's one of the building blocks of financial services globally. And it's the glue and the liquid that keeps the ability for institutions to operate at the front end, providing either consumers or large corporates or other asset managers and folk like that with the ability to transact their business. And what's different, I think, when I think about capital markets, and I try and talk to my colleagues who run core banking platforms and things like that, when we're providing solutions on the core banking side, as you know, it's all about the consumer experience, how that consumer can get access to either information about their business or about products and services and transact them. I think the word is frictionlessly as possible. But in a sense, a lot of the energy goes into driving that outcome. Now, you have to have heavy lifting stuff in the background to make it all work, but that's your mission and objective. When I compare that to the wholesale markets or the capital markets.
And by wholesale markets, capital markets, do we still mean something like foreign exchange, debt and equity as the principal buckets into which pretty much everything fits?
Yeah, I think it's foreign exchange, debt, equity. It's then the derivative transactions that go on top of those to provide some of the liquidity in the market. But at its heart, it's that physical transaction to give an organization a loan to enable them to run capital or to, as you mentioned, raise stock or debt in the market. Those are the fundamentals of the business, and which don't get seen by the vast majority of people from a day-to-day standpoint. But because of that, the sorts of concerns that organizations have and the challenges organizations have, firstly, it's incredibly highly regulated. And whilst we know the consumer side is highly regulated as well, the investment banking, particularly because of the global financial crisis and other things that have happened subsequent to that, there's a lot of oversight and a lot of things that you have to report on and comply with to make your business run effectively. And because of that, when we look at the volume of transactions taking place, they're high value, but there's also a huge volume of activity that takes place as well. And so the things that occupy the minds of our clients today are first of all, how do I do that efficiently? How do I do it with quality? Because any break in that process is costly. And then secondly, how do I get access to the data that surrounds those transactions so that I can then show I'm compliant with regulation? Having sort of boiled it down to that, it sounds quite simple, but a transaction in capital markets is a lot more complicated than just depositing money in a bank account. If you looked at it in accounting entries alone, an FX transaction is something like 18 accounting entries versus 2 on a deposit.
And in terms of breaking the system, software, whatever you want to call it, computer marketplace down, I was about to say it's always been the case. It hasn't actually. Surprisingly, recently it wasn't the case. But if you go back 25 years, I don't think the market particularly existed. But certainly in the last 20 years, all these vast banks doing vast amounts of transactions in a very complicated way, it's pretty much being an oligopoly in terms of, if you're a megabank, they've got to come to somebody like you guys or whatever,
yes.
Because they need a whole suite of systems that hang together and do some hugely complicated things. So is it a market where it is an oligopoly of people who have been around and have grown and all that kind of stuff, and there's basically next to no chance that somebody starting tomorrow is going to get anywhere? Or are there, as always, new niches cropping up where half a dozen people in a sort of room in Shoreditch can actually make some progress?
I think regulation has definitely created boundaries or barriers to entry for the market as a whole. I think, though, when you talk about capital markets, and you go to the extremes, there's new brokerage houses in the US where they can set up with relatively lightweight infrastructure. They're leveraging others. They have to buy some tools for compliance and things like that, but actually they can get up and running, and there is capital and investment that is out there that is going to enable them to happen. Same thing in the lending space. There's a lot of, when interest rates are low as they are today, there's a lot of potential in that environment, particularly when you look at how less liquid or less investable activities that go on around business models to enable that lending process. And so I think there is opportunity out there, and there's definitely innovation going on, definitely.
Yes, I come across one or two of them myself. And I guess that the thing is then that for the sort of oligopolistic banks, and actually compared to any other economic sector, there are far more banks than there are, drug companies, shall we say, that the core plumbing, electricity, lighting, gas, they don't have gas in banks, do they, is something that has to be done by a huge vendor. And that's a very known marketplace. But buildings have more than electricity and plumbing in them.
Yes.
The rooms are full of stuff, and coming to this room, there's a tree there. For all I know, there isn't one like it in the whole organisation. So there still is some symbiosis, and I like the point about how regulation creates the world. I'm finishing off this goddamn book at the moment, and I just added an appendix on perspective on regulation, by which I did a little bit on regulation in ancient Assyria 4,000 years ago, and regulation in the Byzantine Empire 1,000 years ago, all of which actually just goes to prove that what we call regulation today is phenomenally anomalous.
Yeah.
Human societies have got around for the whole of history without having regulations that are millions of paragraphs long. And I think the stat that I saw was Citigroup, where 30,000 of 204,000 employees work in compliance risk, etc., etc. So that's a subject I'll discuss with Sir Paul Tucker on the show. And it can't keep carrying on in this direction, because otherwise in a century, 99% of Citigroup will be in compliance risk, etc., etc. I mean, there'll be one poor sod trying to make all the bloody money, and he'll have to take masses of risk to pay for these people. It's a bit like the Dutch tulip bulb mania. Suddenly tulip bulbs go to all sorts of crazy prices. People say, of course, they're going to go to crazy prices, and they're going to go to crazy ones, and blah, 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 and that lasts for a while. We've got sort of a debut de sec mania or bubble in regulation, as far as I can see. But anyway, that's another one for another time.
I think one of the challenges with it is that it's sort of a set of sequential activities and events that layer on top of each other. If you were to kind of pare it back to what are you trying to manage here? What risk are you trying to make sure is being managed? And almost say, here's a clean sheet, how do we start again? You'd get away with something a lot more straightforward and more effective in terms of its ability to be implemented, and the cost of doing so would come down as well. I think part of the problem is we've layered on over time. That's what doesn't seem to kind of change, is people don't kind of look back again and say, okay, what was the fundamental of what we're trying to manage here, and therefore what does this compliance framework look like?
Absolutely. Well, you're old and you're clearly wise, because that's precisely where I'm coming from. But I had a conversation with someone younger the other day in Fintech who seemed to be completely clear about what the goals of the regulator were, whereas my perspective was that, to a certain extent, the means have become the goal. You know, it's as Tucker has said. I mean, he spent his lifetime as a senior regulator. It's just become stuff that they do because they do, and then more people get sucked in and more people get sucked in. And, you know, you mentioned before about whether we're all here a little bit and people will be living in Canary Wharf. By the time this comes out, Mr. Johnson will either have his sort of head on a stake in the in the Tower of London, or will be a national hero, or perhaps something in the middle. But a lot of this is driven by Europe and things like MiFID II with 2 million paragraphs.
Yes.
As you say, at some point in time, somebody, even in Europe, if Britain's not there, not up to us, will take a step back and say, hang on, I know we've all kind of forgotten, but what was the point of this? And isn't there an easier way of doing it than 2 million paragraphs? Because, having been a head of risk myself in the past, one's got to be very aware of the law of unintended outcomes. You have more and more regulations, you have more and more people in compliance to control it more and more and more, but perversely, it becomes more and more risky, precisely because an ever-increasing percentage of megabank isn't actually making any money. So the decreasing percentage that is making money has to take some crazy risk somehow at some point in time to pay for it all.
But I think one of the consequences of that evolution of regulation is that banks have also sort of gone about it in segregated ways as well. And I think whilst that worked and has worked for many years, I think we're getting to a point now where
it's unsustainable.
Yeah, it will become unsustainable, certainly. And I think what we're doing, and so the Consolidated Audit Trail is a big regulation that's kicking off in the US.
And what does that mean in English?
It really is a global repository of trading data. So in the event of another liquidity crisis and some unforeseen event, you can see clearly where a transaction is occurring. But it's gathering a lot of information around the trading environment. And one of the opportunities I think we're now seeing is having put in place a data lake, or all of this data associated with being able to comply with that regulation. You now have the ability and the data there to be able to do so much more with it.
You can learn stuff about your business, ways of making more money, for the sake of argument.
It's a combination of both other regulation that you can now use that same data for, which you've previously had in a number of other places, or, to your point, actually you've got there incredible intelligence about your business activity and leveraging tools on top of it to try and actually, as you said, make money.
And a good example is where we started with the architecture of the city. It's grown up in an extremely higgledy-piggledy fashion. I think they've rather lost the plot now. And at a certain point, you sort of move to Canary Wharf and say, OK, here's some empty space. Let's do a green field and let's plan this rationally and logically. And there's far more capacity in Canary Wharf in a smaller space without being stuck by the constraints of everything's grown up higgledy-piggledy. Right, OK, so that's the sort of challenges. And we're moving slightly in now to the opportunities side of the equation. I mean, in terms of your day job and in terms of why people do capital markets systems as a whole, well, they have various challenges, like the regulator wants more and more information, so they've got to provide it somehow. And if they're only just doing that, then they're just sort of paying money to keep some other regulators happy rather than doing anything for themselves. So let's explore a little bit more about the opportunities for clients. So we've touched on the fact that actually they can learn stuff about their business, they can do it more efficiently. What actually is in it for sort of banks and clients and FS organisations?
Well, I think one of the obstacles, as you said, that you've got to overcome is how do you employ the capital that you're given or allocated from an investment banking or capital market standpoint in the best possible way. And I think the biggest opportunity that's out there is being able to be agile enough to be able to shift that capital around to different business activities. But to do that, there's got a couple of consequences. One, you've got to be agile enough from an organisation standpoint to be able to take on a volume of activity that will result from that. So you've got to be able to process it. So one of the trends that has, it's been around for the last 5 or 6 years, but it's starting to increase, is for our clients to look at their business and say, so what are we in business to do? Let's peel it back a bit and say, where's the opportunity? What are the things that we're doing today which are actually not differentiating in terms of our clients, the corporations, the asset managers, and so on? What are the things that are, if you like, more commoditized than they would have been before because of regulation, and actually seeking to kind of distance themselves from the processing of activity, which is non-differentiating? And I think if they can do that, then what they enable is two things. First of all, they don't have to worry about the cost of change of that infrastructure sitting behind it. They don't have to worry necessarily, other than knowing that from a vendor standpoint, they're managing it so that when they want to take on capacity, they can do. It just gives them the ability to, I think, act and react a lot more quickly. I think one of the other big challenges is, and any organization, I think, develops this, is you develop this inertia, which is whatever I'm doing tomorrow is inextricably kind of tied to what I did yesterday. And by that I mean you'll carry on doing the same thing, behaving in the same way, acting in the same way by default. And it could be operations teams, it could be technology teams.
It could be life.
Could be life. Indeed, it could be life.
You go to holiday the same place you went last year.
Yeah, and by the way, I quite enjoy that, going to Tuscany, by the way. That tends to be my holiday escape. But when it comes to that activity, if you can find ways to break that inertia, and that's extremely tough to do, then I think you start to see those opportunities and be able to exploit those other opportunities from a business standpoint. I talked a little bit about compliance and the drag that does, but I also talked about, I do think there is an opportunity to take it to the next phase from a technology standpoint. And inevitably it turns to technology, because actually when you consider the activity that most of our customers undertake, it's really risk-taking, compliance, and then the execution, of those activities. These days, the execution is becoming incredibly streamlined. The volumes that go through the markets on an automated basis is just absolutely massive. It's only enabled because technology is there. Without it, an institution probably 10 years ago, it wouldn't be able to recognize necessarily the processing and activity that takes place in businesses today.
I was astonished when I saw the 9 trillion figure on your website. I mean, of course, I'd never actually thought of a number like that. And back when I knew a little bit about these kind of systems, I don't think anybody had added it up, presumably because for regulatory compliance reasons, nobody needed to look at it in the first place, and no one ever did. But it's to say it's a phenomenal amount is to sort of understate the amount.
Yeah, it is. And, for our clients who, some of those solutions operate in-house, some operate on a managed services basis. I think it is a significant challenge in which to manage that. But equally, it also becomes a little bit easier to manage it when you know that you're trying to federate some of the costs of processing and things like that. If you're having to create every bit of infrastructure yourself, then it starts to get, and it's unique, then it's incredibly costly to maintain.
That, of course, all makes sense, as it would, because you're immersed in this world. And one point occurs to me, in terms of the word digital we all use, which to me is kind of your phone in your pocket and computers doing lots of stuff and all that. Obviously, we've seen that digital affects the customer experience in things like app-only banks.
Yes.
Certainly affected mine recently, because Monzo completely changed their app and I can't find a bloody thing now. It drives me around the bend, actually, when companies do this. I mean, the good thing about my TV is everything's the same as it was yesterday. I don't have to think. Or my car, I get into the car, the accelerator is always on the right, and then I don't have a brake and a clutch because it's automatic now. Brake, and there's a steering wheel. Everything's there. So I can do it automatically. And one of the things that sort of drives me around the bend about tech companies is that for my benefit, i.e. for their reasons or whatever, they suddenly change everything around. And, I just don't want to spend another week understanding how to use an app. Anyway, that's just a sort of a gripe I had recently. So I just started using my Revolut card instead. Anyway, so that's the world of B2C, where digital is kind of, it's clear what it means. Yes, I can do stuff on my phone. I didn't have a phone 25 years ago. I can do stuff I never imagined 25 years ago I'd be doing on my phone, buying Christmas presents or whatever. That's very clear. And people sort of say, digital's affecting financial services. I've probably even said it myself once or twice, and I just said it there and again. But does digital mean anything, or does it really mean anything when you're in the sort of grown-up industrial scale businesses that you're in? I mean, people are not particularly doing stuff on their phone, or they get beaten up by the regulator if they are. I mean, what does digital mean in your world?
I think it does mean something. It means a number of, I think, important elements, but I think it's different, to your point, to the consumer world. First and foremost, it's around access to data. So access to data when you've got high-value data, high volume, and you've got regulatory compliance to contend with is critical. And when we talk about access to data, I mentioned briefly about data lakes and moving data into a form which can be consumed in a number of different ways. When I think about digital, it's enabling access to that data from our customer standpoint. The second is when you think about wholesale markets, lowering cost, it's a fantastic environment on which to put machine learning and artificial intelligence. Those tools do two things. First of all, they will undertake a lot of the transaction, and where potential breaks are, eliminate those, the need or the opportunity for those breaks to occur. The second thing they can do, though, is sit across that data and spot opportunities or trends from a business standpoint, which will help it. We run an annual readiness report, we call it, which is a survey of top industry executives around the world. And one interesting nugget that we pulled out of the last survey was that for the top 20% who claim to be most advanced in terms of their use of artificial intelligence from a business execution standpoint, when we compared the growth rate of them versus the rest of the peers in the industry, they were growing twice as fast.
And is that the chicken or the egg?
Well, so big question, and it's probably a combination of the two. And what do I mean by that? I think there is you have to get into an organizational culture which encourages change and the implementation of this type of technology, and to be able to accept the reliance on this type of technology. That requires a certain style of organization to do it. And it could well be that an organization that's already doing that is predisposed to be growing faster than another one anyway. But what is very clear is that if you can adopt that type of technology, you can drag yourself along that curve as well.
So chicken and egg is, of course, an unfortunate way of putting it, because the chickens and eggs go very linearly over the generations. But a virtuous circle is another way. You've got two components that are interacting. Yes. You've got better systems, it helps the business. You've got a better business, you need better systems. It's a virtuous as opposed to sort of a vicious circle. Right, so that's very interesting. And certainly I shall take away from this to be more careful using the word digital in terms of grown-up FS and grown-up fintech. And maybe in my mind differentiate between digital, which for me is largely sort of interwebby phones. So somebody in Australia, to your point, they can actually listen to this show, our conversation, which is phenomenal. Couldn't have imagined that 30 years ago.
It's fantastic. And by and large, our interaction with the world as we day to day is through, phones and mobile and things like that. And that's how most people imagine it. And indeed, it is the case, but behind the scenes, there's got to be a lot of other digital going on.
Yes, exactly. And that to your point, well explained, which is that in the grown-up world, where people are talking trillions of dollars, not millions of dollars, it really is about, in a sense, just the rollout of the information age. I mean, when you were talking, I was thinking of, in the early 90s, when I became the first head of risk in the city, I had a pocket calculator, and I'd have some printout of numbers, and I'd be just doing the standard deviation on those. You couldn't have anything like that. And as the decades go by in the information age, then people use information in very different ways. So, so digital versus information.
But a lot of the learning comes from that front end. Things like blockchain came out of Bitcoin and digital currency.
And have gone nowhere so far, but that's a whole other topic.
Let's put that
on one side. Maybe you're the world leader of blockchain. I shouldn't have said it. Let's put that on one side. Anyway, we will see. And as I've said many, many times, I, more than anybody, almost in the entire world, I'm very pleased if 1 million new ideas come up, because I've got 1 million new shows. So, but on that one, I'm still particularly waiting. Right, okay, so before we wrap up the show, I'd like to thank all the listeners out there, whether you're working in the old or new, the large or small worlds, or whether you're working in the sort of the digital phony world, or whether you're working on industrial scale projects. I'd like to thank my brand partners for the podcast, Smart Pension, who are fast, secure and free. Check out their UK workplace pensions at autoenrollment.co.uk, which is also a note to myself. I must chase Will sometime, who's always so busy, to get him to give me a new strapline, because that one's been around for a while and they're doing lots of sexier things by now. Right, so thanks for that, Martin. We've covered a very solid topic, and I hope that people have taken away a feel for the world, when they're not in it, about what it's like. And for those people sort of slightly further away from both, some idea of big co and small co, some idea of existing FS and vendors and softwares and fintechs. So would you like to tell us a little bit more about FIS? In my ignorance of roughly everything, I actually had to look up FIS, I'm sad to say, but I haven't been in this world for some time. I had heard of Sungod.
Thank you. Yeah, so FIS, 3 primary businesses. We operate in capital markets, the one I'm responsible for. We have merchant services business, which provides solutions including the WorldPay brand, recently part of the business. And then we have our core banking and payments, integrated payments businesses, which operate throughout the world, providing core banking and payments technology. I think fundamentally, if you haven't looked at FIS's solutions recently, I think it's definitely worth having another look. We've made massive investments in next-gen technology around not just digital, as I've been talking around APIs to improve access to solutions, but also bringing products together to provide end-to-end processing for clients. So things like derivatives processing, securities, commercial lending, onboarding, being able to understand your customers in a level of depth that you didn't have before and being able to make good decisions against that. And then, of course, things like regulation and compliance and being able to transform a lot of what goes on in private equity firms and hedge funds. So very broad set of solutions. As I said, a lot of investment in new platforms, both modernizing and bringing new solutions to market. And when I think about our customers' business problems, things like efficiency of processing, compliance, access to data, I think we can show customers there's a lot of ways in which they can solve their problems. And so, we'd love to have the opportunity, and, that's what we're in business to do.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much. Time has gone past very quickly, as I heard, and I think the other thing I was thinking, listening to you, is I'm rather glad I began my career in a world where sort of suddenly I didn't see a laptop until the mid-90s in Claremont in the city. It was much easier to sort of be a bluffer in those days. These days you need clever people and computers that have got all this stuff together, which obviously you guys have. And so I wish you every success in the future.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks for listening. If you have consulting, advisory/non-exec or media needs in the FS or fintech space, get in touch with me at mike@londonfintechpodcast.com.
We could sit in a bend there all day, watching the firelight dance, watching the firelight dance. We could walk in the mountains before dawn, watching a happy moonrise, watching a happy moonrise. Come away from the city, with the tarmac so dead and the people so sad. Come away from the city, with the faces so grey, with the pain of the everyday. We are wild like the mountains and the trees. Can you see what I mean? Can you see what I mean? We fit in between the earth and the sky. Kiss the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye. City goodbye. Watch the firelight dance with me. 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 Watch the firelight dance.